The whispers followed Olivia Blackwood like shadows, clinging to her skirts as she moved through the dusty streets of Redemption, Arizona Territory, 1875. She kept her eyes downcast, clutching her worn leather-bound journal to her chest as though it might shield her from the venom of their words. "Witch," they hissed. "Death bringer," they warned. For 3 years since her arrival, not a soul had dared to touch her skin, believing a single contact would bring ruin upon their house. Olivia quickened her pace as she passed the general store where Mrs. Patterson dramatically pulled her young son behind her skirts. The woman made the sign of the cross, her lips moving in silent prayer. Olivia pretended not to notice, though the familiar ache of loneliness throbbed deeper in her chest. 22 years of life, and she'd known true connection only in the pages of her books. "Watch yourself," growled the blacksmith as she passed too close to his shop. "We don't need no more accidents in this town." Olivia's throat tightened. The accidents they blamed on her: a fire at the livery, the schoolteacher's broken leg, the influenza that took 3 children last winter had nothing to do with her. But tragedy had followed her from Boston to this dusty corner of the Arizona Territory, and the townsfolk needed someone to blame. The only sanctuary she found was in her small cabin at the edge of town, where she lived alone with her books and herbs. As the town's reluctant midwife and healer, a role thrust upon her by necessity, rather than choice, she was tolerated, if not welcomed. Her knowledge of medicine, learned from her physician father before his death, made her valuable enough to keep around but dangerous enough to fear. As Olivia rounded the corner toward the apothecary, the only shopkeeper who would still sell to her, albeit through the back door, she collided with a solid wall of muscle and leather. Strong hands steadied her shoulders before she could fall, and she found herself looking up into the most striking blue eyes she'd ever seen. "Pardon me, madam," said the stranger, his voice deep and smooth as aged whiskey. "Didn't see you there." For a moment, Olivia forgot to breathe. The man before her stood over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered and sun-bronzed. Dark hair curled beneath a worn Stetson, and a few days' worth of stubble shadowed his jawline. He wore trail dust like it was part of his outfit, a man clearly just arrived in town. A newcomer. Someone who didn't yet know to avoid her. "You're touching me," she whispered, stepping back hastily. The man's eyebrows rose slightly, amusement flickering across his features. "Is that not allowed in these parts?" Before she could respond, a shout came from across the street. "Watch yourself, stranger. That there's the witch woman." The smile died on the stranger's face as he turned toward the voice. Butch Miller, the saloon owner, stood on the boardwalk, arms crossed. "She's cursed," Miller continued. "Touch her and you'll be dead within a fortnight. Everyone knows it." The stranger looked back at Olivia, his gaze assessing but not unkind. "That true, madam? You carrying around that much power in those pretty hands?" Heat rushed to Olivia's cheeks. No one had spoken to her so directly or called any part of her pretty in years. "No," she said softly, "but it doesn't matter what's true, only what they believe." She stepped around him, intending to continue on her way, but his voice stopped her. "Name's Deacon Reed," he called after her, "and I don't much care for other folks telling me who I can and can't touch." Olivia didn't turn around, but her steps faltered. Something warm and dangerous unfurled in her chest, something that felt dangerously like hope. "You will," she replied, just loud enough for him to hear. "Once you've been in Redemption a day or two, you'll believe just like the rest of them." The sun beat down mercilessly as Deacon Reed led his horse to the town livery. He'd spent the last 3 years drifting through the territories, taking work where he could find it, mostly as a ranch hand, occasionally as hired muscle when situations got desperate. Redemption wasn't much different from a dozen other frontier towns he'd passed through. One main street, a couple of saloons, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse, and enough desperate souls to keep the undertaker in business. But that woman, she was different. There was something in her eyes that called to him. Not fear, though he'd seen plenty of that. Something more like resignation, like she'd accepted a fate she didn't deserve. "You're new," said the liveryman, a grizzled old-timer with a permanent squint. "Passing through or staying?" "Depends on what work there is," Deacon replied, handing over a few coins. "Heard the Rocking M might be hiring." The liveryman nodded. "Marshall Mitchell's spread. Good man, fair wages. His foreman was in yesterday saying they needed hands for the spring roundup." "Much obliged for the information." Deacon patted his horse's neck. "Take good care of Thunder here. He's carried me a long way." "Will do." The man hesitated. "Say, that woman you were talking to earlier, the one everyone's calling a witch," the liveryman's face darkened. "Miss Blackwood." "Strange things happen around her. 3 years ago she shows up in town during the worst drought in memory. That very night, a lightning storm hits, burns down the church and kills the reverend." "Bad luck doesn't make a witch," Deacon said mildly. "Ain't just that. Wherever she goes, misfortune follows. Folks who cross her end up injured or worse. Young Johnny Peterson called her names last summer. Next day, fell off his horse and broke his arm in 3 places. Boys fall off horses every day." The liveryman shook his head. "You're not listening, stranger. Last winter, she argued with Widow Mason about some remedy. 3 days later, the widow's prize milk cow died. No explanation. Deacon had heard similar tales in every territory he'd crossed. Someone different, someone alone. They always bore the blame when crops failed or sickness spread. Usually a woman, often one with knowledge of herbs and healing. The kind of woman who threatened the natural order simply by existing outside a man's protection. "What's she still doing here if everyone's so afraid of her?" Deacon asked. "She's the only midwife for 50 miles. And she knows her medicines saved more than a few lives when Doc Simmons was too drunk to help. Folks hate her, but they need her." The liveryman spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "They just make sure not to touch her skin. That's how the curse transfers, see?" Deacon thought of the brief moment he'd held her shoulders, the softness beneath his fingers, the warmth. He'd felt no curse, only a woman. A lonely woman with eyes that had seen too much suffering. "What's her first name?" he asked. The liveryman looked startled by the question. "Olivia, I think." "Why? You planning on calling on her? Because that would be a mistake, mister. A big one." Deacon just smiled. "I've made my share of mistakes. One more won't hurt." The Rockingham Ranch sprawled across 5,000 acres of prime grazing land about 10 miles outside of Redemption. By midday, Deacon had secured work as a ranch hand and was being shown around by the foreman, a taciturn man named Harris who seemed to have forgotten how to smile. "Bunkhouse is there," Harris pointed. "Mess hall's behind it. We ride out at dawn, back at dusk. Pays $40 a month plus room and board." "Fair enough," Deacon nodded. It wasn't much, but it was steady work, and after months of drifting, he could use a place to stay for a while. "One more thing," Harris added, fixing Deacon with a hard stare. "Stay away from town as much as possible. Last thing we need is our men getting into trouble." "Any particular trouble you're worried about?" Harris's mouth thinned to a grim line. "There's a woman in town. Some call her a healer, others call her worse. Whatever she is, she's brought nothing but bad luck to those who get close to her. Marshall Mitchell's boy, Billy, took a shine to her when she first came to town. 3 years ago, that was." Deacon kept his expression neutral. "What happened?" "Billy rode out one morning after visiting her. Horse came back without him. Found his body at the bottom of Eagle Canyon. Neck broken." Harris crossed himself. "The woman wasn't even sorry. said it was fate or some such nonsense. Marshall wanted to run her out of town, but the womenfolk protected her, said they needed her knowledge of medicines and birthing. Sounds like an accident to me, Deacon observed. Canyons and horses can be a dangerous combination. Harris gave him a sharp look. You already met her, didn't you? I can see it in your face. Deacon didn't bother denying it. Bumped into her in town. Seemed like a normal woman to me. They always do, that's how they get you. Harris shook his head. Just stay clear of her if you value your job here. Marshall Mitchell won't have any of his men associating with the woman he believes killed his son. That night in the bunkhouse, Deacon lay awake, listening to the snores of the other ranch hands. His thoughts kept returning to Olivia Blackwood and the sadness that seemed to cloak her like a shawl. A woman alone in a town that feared her, needed her, but wouldn't touch her. He'd known isolation, had chosen it for himself after the war left him hollow. But he couldn't imagine enduring what she did, living among people who crossed the street to avoid her shadow, the accusations, the whispers. Deacon had never been one to follow the crowd. 3 years in the war had taught him that men were capable of believing all manner of nonsense when fear took hold. He'd seen freed slaves blamed for poor harvests, Mexican families accused of stealing cattle when the real rustlers were white men in positions of power. He'd learned to trust his own judgment above gossip and superstition, and his judgment told him Olivia Blackwood was no witch, just a woman who'd had the misfortune of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, who perhaps possessed knowledge that made others uncomfortable. As sleep finally claimed him, Deacon made a decision. His day off was coming Sunday. He would go into town and seek out the so-called witch, not because he believed in curses, but because he recognized the look in her eyes, the look of someone who'd been alone too long. Sunday dawned clear and bright. Deacon rode into Redemption just as church services were ending, watching from astride thunder as the townsfolk filed out of the rebuilt church. He noticed how they clustered together, chatting and making plans for Sunday dinner, children darting between adults' legs in games of tag, and he noticed the solitary figure walking in the opposite direction, a basket over one arm, her back straight despite the weight of the town stairs. Olivia Blackwood. She wore a simple blue dress that had seen better days, her dark hair pinned neatly at the nape of her neck. Despite the whispers that followed her, she moved with a quiet dignity that stirred something in Deacon's chest. He urged Thunder forward, cutting across the street to intercept her path. The townsfolk fell silent, watching with undisguised curiosity as he approached the witch woman. "Miss Blackwood," he called, tipping his hat. "Fine morning, isn't it?" Olivia stopped, surprise flickering across her features before she masked it. "Mr. Reed, I didn't expect to see you again. Told you my name but never got yours properly. The folks around here have been filling in the gaps, though." He dismounted, leading Thunder by the reins as he fell into step beside her. She glanced at him warily. "And what exactly have they told you? That you're dangerous, cursed, that a man would be a fool to come near you?" A flash of hurt crossed her face before she could hide it. "Then why are you here?" Deacon smiled. "Never claimed to be anything but a fool, madam." Despite herself, the corner of Olivia's mouth twitched upward. "You're working at the Rockingham now, I heard. Marshall Mitchell won't like you speaking to me." "I don't much care what Marshall Mitchell likes," Deacon replied easily. "Where are you headed with that basket?" Olivia hesitated, then seemed to decide honesty was the simplest approach. "To the Wilkins place outside town. Their youngest has a fever that won't break. Mrs. Wilkins sent word this morning. Mind if I walk with you? It's a fair distance." "You don't understand," Olivia said, lowering her voice. "People are watching. If you're seen with me, let them watch," Deacon interrupted. "I've faced Confederate bullets and Apache arrows." Don't reckon a few stairs will be the end of me." For a long moment, Olivia studied him, as if trying to understand what manner of man would willingly court the town's disapproval. Finally, she nodded. "It's your reputation, Mr. Reed." "Deacon," he corrected. "And I never much cared for reputations anyway." They walked in silence for a while, aware of the stares following them as they left the town behind. Deacon noticed how Olivia kept a careful distance between them, as if afraid an accidental touch might confirm the town's superstitions. "How'd you come to be in Redemption?" he asked eventually. "Doesn't seem the most welcoming place for a woman alone." Olivia's expression clouded. "It wasn't by choice. I was traveling west with my father. He was a physician. We were headed to San Francisco, where he had a position waiting at a hospital." She swallowed hard. "We stopped here when our wagon broke an axle. While we waited for repairs, a fever swept through town. My father offered his services." "Let me guess," Deacon said quietly. "He caught the fever himself." Olivia nodded. "He died 3 days after the reverend. By then, people had already begun to whisper about us, about me. I had no money to continue to San Francisco, and the stage wouldn't take me anyway, said I might be carrying the sickness." "So you stayed?" "I stayed. Used what my father had taught me to make a place for myself. It wasn't much of a place, but it was something." She glanced at him. "What about you? What brings a man like you to a town like this?" Deacon shrugged. "Been drifting since the war. Cavalry, 4th Regiment. After what I saw, couldn't settle anywhere for long." "The war changed many men," Olivia observed. "My father treated soldiers who came home different. Different is one way to put it." Deacon didn't elaborate, and she didn't press. They reached the Wilkins' small homestead to find a harried mother waiting at the door with a feverish child in her arms. Mrs. Wilkins froze at the sight of Deacon accompanying Olivia, her eyes widening in alarm. "Miss Blackwood," she greeted stiffly. "I didn't expect you to bring company. Mr. Reed was kind enough to escort me," Olivia replied, her voice taking on a professional tone Deacon hadn't heard before. "How is Timothy?" "Worse." Mrs. Wilkins's concern for her child momentarily overrode her wariness. "The fever won't break, and he started coughing something terrible. May I?" Olivia held out her arms, and Mrs. Wilkins hesitated only briefly before transferring the listless child to her. Deacon noticed how carefully Olivia arranged the blanket, ensuring her bare skin didn't touch the boy directly, not out of fear for herself, he realized, but in deference to the mother's superstitions. "I'll wait out here," Deacon said, sensing his presence would only complicate matters. Olivia nodded gratefully and followed Mrs. Wilkins inside. Through the open door, Deacon watched as she examined the child with gentle efficiency, listening to his breathing and feeling his forehead through the blanket. She spoke softly to the mother, her demeanor calm and assured, nothing like the nervous woman who walked through town with downcast eyes. This was her element, he realized. This was where she found purpose. An hour later, Olivia emerged from the cabin, her basket lighter. The lines of worry had deepened around her eyes. "Pneumonia," she said quietly as they started back toward town. "I've left medicines and instructions, but the child is very weak." "Will he live?" Olivia's shoulders sagged slightly. "I don't know. I've done what I can, but—" She trailed off. "If he dies, they'll blame me. They always do. And if he lives, they'll credit God or luck or the child's constitution, never me." There was no bitterness in her voice, only resignation. They walked in companionable silence until the town came into view again. Olivia stopped at the edge of the main street. "You should go on ahead," she said. "No sense in both of us facing their stares." Deacon shook his head. "That's not how this works, Miss Blackwood." Before she could protest, he offered his arm, a gentleman's gesture she clearly hadn't experienced in years. Olivia stared at it as if it might bite her. "I can't," she whispered. "They say—" "I know what they say," Deacon replied gently. "I just don't believe it." Their eyes met, and something passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of two souls who understood what it meant to stand apart from others. Slowly, hesitantly, Olivia placed her gloved hand on his offered arm. Together, they walked into town, ignoring the gasps and whispers that followed them down the main street. Deacon felt her trembling slightly beside him, but noticed how she held her head higher with each step. When they reached the small cabin at the edge of town that she called home, Olivia turned to him. "Thank you," she said simply. "It's been a long time since anyone in this town walked beside me instead of away from me." "My pleasure, Miss Blackwood." Deacon tipped his hat. "Perhaps I could call on you again, next Sunday maybe." Hope and fear warred in her expression. "That would be nice, but your job, let me worry about that," he smiled. "Until next Sunday then." As Deacon rode back to the rocking M, he knew he'd just made a choice that would have consequences. But watching Olivia Blackwood walk into her lonely cabin, he couldn't bring himself to regret it. Word spread quickly through Redemption about the newcomer who had escorted the witch woman through town. By the time Deacon returned to the ranch that evening, Harris was waiting for him, face like thunder. "Heard you've been making friends in town," the foreman said, blocking Deacon's path to the bunkhouse. "With the Blackwood woman, no less." Deacon met the man's gaze steadily. "Walked a lady home, didn't realize that was against ranch rules." "She ain't no lady," Harris spat. "She's a curse on this town, and Marshal Mitchell won't have any of his men consorting with her. Not after what happened to Billy." "From what I understand, Billy Mitchell died in a riding accident," Deacon replied evenly. "Tragic, but hardly supernatural." Harris stepped closer, jabbing a finger into Deacon's chest. "You listen here, Reed. You got a choice to make. Either you stay clear of that woman or you find work elsewhere. That the marshal's ultimatum or yours, does it matter, results the same either way." Harris crossed his arms. "Well." Deacon considered his options. He needed the work, his funds were running low after months of drifting. But something about Olivia Blackwood's quiet dignity and the townsfolk's cruelty toward her stirred a protectiveness in him he hadn't felt in years. "I'll have my decision by morning," he said finally. That night, sleep eluded him. He stared at the rough-hewn ceiling of the bunkhouse, weighing practicality against principle. By dawn, he knew what he had to do. He found Harris at the corral, supervising the breaking of a new Mustang. "Made your choice?" the foreman asked without preamble. "I have," Deacon nodded. "I'll be moving my gear out today." Harris didn't look surprised. "Figured as much. You got that stubborn look about you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small pouch. "Week's wages." "Marshall says to tell you no hard feelings, just business." Deacon accepted the coins with a nod. "Appreciate that. Tell him I understand his position." "You headed back to drifting then?" "No," Deacon said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "Think I'll stay in Redemption a while. Town could use another pair of working hands." Harris's eyebrows shot up. "For her? You're throwing away good work for a woman you barely know." Deacon didn't answer directly. "Seen enough injustice in my time. Don't care to stand by and watch more of it." "Your funeral," Harris muttered, turning back to the corral. By noon, Deacon had moved his few possessions to the small room above the livery stable that the owner, a gruff but fair-minded man named Johnson, had agreed to rent him. The arrangement included care for Thunder and came with the understanding that Deacon would help with repairs around the place when needed. "Don't care who you socialize with," Johnson had said when Deacon inquired about the room. "Long as the rent's paid and you don't bring trouble to my door." It wasn't much: a narrow bed, a washstand, and a three-legged table, but it was his own, and it came without conditions on who he could or couldn't befriend. The next day, Deacon began asking around town for work. The blacksmith needed an assistant, but closed his door in Deacon's face when he learned who his new tenant was. The general store owner was more polite but equally firm in his refusal. By mid-afternoon, Deacon was beginning to understand firsthand the power of redemption's collective judgment. He was considering his dwindling options when a weathered wagon pulled up beside him. At the reins sat an elderly man with a silver beard and sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "You'd be the fella who's got everyone in a tizzy over the Blackwood girl," the old man said, looking Deacon up and down. "Name's Obadiah Quinn. Most folks call me Old Quinn." "Deacon Reed," he replied, offering his hand, which the old man shook with surprising strength. "Heard you're looking for work and no one's hiring on account of your poor taste in walking companions." Quinn's eyes twinkled with mischief. "That about the size of it," Deacon nodded cautiously. "Word travels fast. Small towns." Quinn shrugged. "I got a spread about 5 miles north. Nothing fancy, couple 100 acres, some cattle, bit of farming. Could use a man who knows horses and isn't afraid of hard work." "Why would you hire me when no one else will?" Quinn snorted. "Because I'm old enough to remember when this town accused Jorge Martinez of bringing the drought of '53 because he was Catholic, and Mei Lin of poisoning the well because she was Chinese, and now it's that poor Blackwood girl's turn." He spat into the dust. "Load of hogwash, all of it. You don't believe she's cursed. Only curse that girl has is being too pretty and too smart in a town full of fools." Quinn adjusted his hat. "Pays $30 a month plus room and board. Not as good as the Rocking M, but you won't have to pretend to believe in nonsense." Deacon found himself smiling for the first time that day. "When do I start?" "Right now, if you're of a mind to. Got a broken fence needs mending before nightfall." By the time Sunday arrived again, Deacon had settled into life at Quinn's modest ranch. The old man worked him hard but treated him fairly, and the isolated location meant fewer judgmental stares. Quinn himself proved to be a fountain of local knowledge, filling Deacon in on the complex web of relationships and histories that made up redemption's social fabric. "That Marshal Daniel Mitchell, he wasn't always so hard," Quinn explained one evening as they sat on the porch after dinner. "Lost his wife to fever same year as his boy died. Something broke in him after that. Needed someone to blame, and the Blackwood girl was convenient." "She blames herself too," Deacon observed, recalling the sadness in Olivia's eyes. Quinn nodded. "Fool girl takes on everyone's misfortunes like they're her own doing. Her pa was the same way, brilliant doctor, but carried the weight of every patient he couldn't save." "You knew her father?" "Met him briefly before he fell ill. Good man. Taught that girl everything he knew about medicine from what I hear." Quinn took a long pull from his pipe. "Shame how they treat her. Town needs her skills, especially with Doc Simmons deep in the bottle most days." On Sunday morning, Deacon rode into town earlier than necessary, taking time to observe the rhythms of redemption's weekend activities. He noticed how the townsfolk gathered at church, their Sunday best a stark contrast to their everyday attire. He also noticed the absence of one particular figure among the churchgoers. After stabling Thunder, he made his way to Olivia's small cabin at the edge of town. The modest structure stood apart from its neighbors, surrounded by a carefully tended garden of herbs and flowers. A thin wisp of smoke rose from the chimney, the only sign of life within. Deacon hesitated at the gate, suddenly uncertain. What if she'd reconsidered? What if his attention had only made her situation worse? Before he could decide whether to proceed, the door opened, and Olivia stepped onto the small porch. She wore a simple dress of deep green, her hair loose around her shoulders instead of in its usual severe knot. The sight of her clearly dressed for company for him sent an unexpected warmth through his chest. "You came," she said, sounding both pleased and surprised. "Said I would." Deacon removed his hat as he approached the porch. "Hope I'm not interrupting anything." A smile ghosted across her lips. "My thrilling Sunday of reading medical texts and repotting herbs." "No, Mr. Reed, you're not interrupting." "Deacon," he reminded her. "And those sound like perfectly respectable Sunday activities to me." Olivia's smile widened slightly. Would you like to come in? I've made tea." The interior of Olivia's cabin revealed much about its owner. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with medical texts and volumes of poetry. Dried herbs hung from the ceiling beams, filling the air with a pleasant, earthy fragrance. Everything was meticulously organized and scrupulously clean, but touches of beauty appeared in unexpected places: a vase of wildflowers on the table, a colorful quilt folded over a rocking chair, sketches of plants pinned to the walls. "It's not much," Olivia said, suddenly self-conscious as she watched Deacon taking her home. "It's exactly what I expected," he replied. "Orderly, thoughtful, beautiful in a quiet way." A blush crept up her neck at his words. She busied herself pouring tea into two mismatched cups, keeping the small table between them as she worked. Deacon noticed how she made sure their fingers didn't touch when she handed him his cup. "I heard you left the Rockingham," she said after they were seated. "Because of me." Deacon shrugged. "Because of their foolishness, not you. Found better work anyway with old Quinn." "Obadiah Quinn." Olivia's expression brightened. "He's a good man, one of the few who still greets me when we pass on the street. He speaks highly of you and your father." They talked easily, the initial awkwardness melting away as the afternoon progressed. Deacon told her about his childhood in Pennsylvania, his years in the cavalry during the war, and his restless, wandering since. Olivia shared stories of growing up with a physician father who taught her to read medical texts before fairy tales, of dreams abandoned when he died, of finding purpose in helping others, even when they feared her touch. "Why do you do it?" Deacon asked, as shadows lengthened across the floor. "Why stay where you're not wanted?" Olivia was silent for a long moment. "Where else would I go? At least here I'm needed, even if I'm not welcomed. There's Mrs. Cooper's arthritis that only my willow bark tea seems to help. The Lawson twins who'd have died in childbirth if I hadn't been there. Little Sarah Jenkins's asthma that I can manage with the right herbs." She looked down at her hands. "I can do good here, even if no one acknowledges it. That's a lonely way to live." "Yes," she agreed simply. "It is." Their eyes met across the table, and Deacon was struck by the quiet strength he saw there. She'd endured years of isolation and accusation, yet still found the courage to help those who spurned her. "Would you permit me to call on you again?" he asked. "Not just Sundays, whenever I'm in town." Hope and fear warred in her expression. "People will talk more than they already do. It could make things difficult for you." "Let them talk," Deacon said. "I've never much cared for other people's opinions." A smile, a real one this time, transformed Olivia's face, making her look younger, lighter. "Then yes, Mr. Red Deacon, I would like that very much." As spring warmed into summer, Deacon fell into a new rhythm. Weekdays were spent at Quinn's ranch, tending cattle and mending fences, learning the business of running a small spread from a man who'd done it successfully for 40 years. But every chance he got, Sundays always, and at least one evening during the week, he rode into town to see Olivia. They were careful at first, meeting at her cabin where curious eyes couldn't follow their every movement. But gradually, Deacon coaxed her into venturing out walks along the creek at sunset, picnics in the meadow beyond town, even brief trips to Johnson's livery so she could meet Thunder. Each outing was marked by stares and whispers, but Deacon noticed how Olivia slowly began to straighten her spine, to meet the gazes of those who had tormented her for so long. And he noticed how some of the townsfolk, mostly women who had benefited from her healing skills, had begun to nod politely when they passed. Not everyone's attitude softened, however. Marshal Mitchell made a point of turning his back whenever they appeared. The saloon owner, Butch Miller, spat in the dirt at their approach, and Mrs. Patterson still pulled her son behind her skirts, whispering warnings about curses and witchcraft. "Does it bother you?" Olivia asked one evening as they walked back to her cabin after such an encounter. "Being the town pariah by association," Deacon chuckled. "Been called worse things than a witch's friend." "Is that what you are, my friend?" There was something vulnerable in her question. He stopped walking, turning to face her in the golden light of sunset. "I think we both know I'm hoping for more than friendship, Olivia." Her breath caught. It was the first time he'd stated so plainly what had been growing between them over the weeks of visits and conversations. "Deacon," she whispered, "I can't ask you to tie yourself to someone the town believes brings death and misfortune. It isn't fair to you. You're not asking, I'm offering." He took a step closer, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes. "And I don't give a damn what this town believes. I believe in you." For a moment he thought she might allow him to kiss her, but she stepped back, shaking her head. "You don't understand. People who get close to me, bad things happen to them. Billy Mitchell, my father, your father caught a fever while treating the sick. Billy Mitchell fell while riding in dangerous territory. Neither of those things had anything to do with you," Deacon said firmly. "You can't know that for certain. I know enough." He reached for her hand, but she pulled away. "Please," she said, her voice breaking. "I couldn't bear it if something happened to you because of me." Deacon wanted to argue further, to break through the wall of superstition that had been built around her, but he saw the genuine fear in her eyes. This wasn't just about the town's beliefs. Olivia herself had begun to wonder if there was truth to their accusations. "All right," he said gently. "But I'm not going anywhere, Olivia. Whatever you believe about yourself, I'm making my own choice, and I choose to be here." July brought scorching heat and clear skies, perfect weather for Quinn's hay harvest, but merciless for anyone working outdoors. Deacon spent long days in the fields, returning to the ranch house, each evening exhausted and sun-baked. "You're working yourself too hard, boy," Quinn observed one night as Deacon picked at his dinner. "She ain't going nowhere." Deacon looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" the old man snorted. "You think I don't notice how you rush through chores on Sundays? Or how you're always finding reasons to ride into town midweek?" Quinn's eyes twinkled. "You've got it bad for the Blackwood girl. There was no point denying it. She's special. That she is." Quinn nodded. "Her father would be proud, seeing how she's held her head up through all this nonsense. Proud of you too, I imagine, for seeing her worth when others wouldn't." "She still won't let me touch her," Deacon admitted. "Believes in the curse, at least a little." Quinn was silent for a moment, tamping tobacco into his pipe. "Might be she's just scared, not of curses, but of hoping again. Girls lost everyone she ever cared for. Easier to keep folks at arm's length than risk more heartbreak." Deacon considered this. "How do I convince her otherwise?" "Can't reason someone out of a fear they didn't reason themselves into," Quinn said, lighting his pipe. "Sometimes you just gotta show 'em." The opportunity to show Olivia came sooner than Deacon expected. 2 days later, he rode into Redemption for supplies and found the town in an uproar. A fire had broken out at the livery, his own temporary home, and men were frantically passing buckets from the town well to douse the flames. Deacon joined the bucket line without hesitation, working alongside men who had shunned him for weeks. The fire was mostly contained to the hayloft, but smoke billowed through the structure, making it difficult to breathe or see. Johnson was directing efforts from outside, his face streaked with soot and worry. "The horses!" Deacon shouted over the commotion. "Most got out," Johnson yelled back. "Thunder's fine in the corral, but there's still one inside Mrs. Lawson's mare. She's in foal, too panicked to move." Without thinking, Deacon handed his bucket to the next man and plunged into the smoke-filled stable. He could hear the frightened whinnies of the trapped horse coming from the last stall. Crouching low where the air was clearer, he made his way to the back of the building. The mare was rearing and kicking, her eyes rolling white with terror. Deacon approached slowly, speaking in low, soothing tones. "Easy, girl. Easy now. We're going to get you out of here." It took precious minutes to calm the horse enough to lead her, minutes during which the smoke grew thicker and burning embers began to fall from the hayloft above. By the time Deacon had her haltered, his lungs burned and his eyes streamed. The mare still balked at moving toward the smoke-filled exit. Removing his bandana, Deacon tied it over the horse's eyes, hoping the blindfold would make her more manageable. It worked. The mare allowed him to lead her forward, though she trembled violently. They had almost reached the door when a burning beam crashed down just feet away, sending up a shower of sparks. The mare reared, nearly trampling Deacon as she bolted past him and out the door to safety. The falling beam had blocked his exit route. Disoriented by smoke and the blow from the panicked horse, Deacon staggered, seeking another way out. The heat was becoming unbearable, the air too thick to breathe. As his vision began to darken at the edges, he heard someone calling his name. A figure appeared through the smoke, slender, determined, with a wet cloth tied over her nose and mouth. "Olivia, this way," she shouted, grabbing his arm. "There's another door at the back." Together they stumbled through the burning stable, Olivia leading him unerringly through the smoke. They burst out into the alley behind the livery, both coughing violently as they gulped fresh air. They made it several yards before Deacon's legs gave out, and he sank to his knees in the dirt. "Breathe," Olivia commanded, kneeling beside him. Her hands, her bare hands that no one in town would touch, moved efficiently over him, checking for burns or other injuries. Slowly, in and out. When his coughing subsided, Deacon looked up at her. Soot streaked her face, and her hair had come loose from its pins, but her eyes were clear and focused. Professional. The healer, not the outcast. "You touched me," he rasped. Olivia froze, suddenly realizing what she'd done. Her hands still rested on his shoulders, skin to skin where his shirt had torn. She began, then stopped, bewilderment crossing her features. "I didn't think. I just saw you go in, and then when you didn't come out, you came in after me," Deacon finished. Not very sensible for someone who thinks she brings misfortune to those she touches. A small, shaky laugh escaped her. "No, I suppose not." Their eyes met, and something shifted between them, a barrier crumbling, a truth acknowledged. Slowly, deliberately, Deacon raised his hand to cover hers where it still rested on his shoulder. "Still waiting for that curse to strike me down," he said softly. "Might be waiting a long time." Before she could respond, they were surrounded by townspeople, some offering water, others congratulating Deacon on saving the mare, a few eyeing Olivia with newfound uncertainty as they witnessed her tending to him without apparent ill effect. Dr. Simmons, surprisingly sober for once, insisted on examining both of them for smoke inhalation. Olivia tried to step back to fade into the crowd as she usually did, but Deacon kept hold of her hand. "She saved my life," he announced clearly, making sure everyone gathered could hear. "Came into a burning building after me when no one else would." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Marshall Mitchell pushed his way forward, his stern face unreadable as he surveyed the scene. "The witch woman went into the fire?" someone asked incredulously. "Miss Blackwood," Deacon corrected firmly. "And yes, she did. Without her, you'd be digging a grave for me tomorrow instead of rebuilding a stable." The marshal's eyes narrowed as they fell on their joined hands. "You're touching her." "Been doing that for a while now," Deacon replied evenly. "Still breathing." A tense silence fell over the gathering. Olivia's grip on Deacon's hand tightened and he could feel her trembling slightly beside him. But she didn't pull away. It was Mrs. Lawson who broke the standoff, stepping forward with tears in her eyes. "That mare you saved, she's carrying the last foal from my husband's prized stallion. James didn't live to see it born." She turned to Olivia. "And you brought my twins safely into this world when everyone said they'd die." The woman swallowed hard. "Thank you, both of you." One by one, others stepped forward with their own acknowledgments. Mr. Johnson thanked Deacon for risking his life for the horses and Olivia for her quick thinking. Old Quinn, who had ridden into town when he heard about the fire, stood nearby, nodding approvingly. Even Dr. Simmons grudgingly admitted that Olivia's herbal remedies had complemented his medical treatments on more than one occasion. Not everyone was convinced. Marshal Mitchell turned away without a word, his back rigid with disapproval. Butch Miller muttered darkly about coincidences and witchcraft. Mrs. Patterson kept her distance, though the fear in her eyes seemed tempered with confusion. But something had changed. As Dr. Simmons led them to his office for treatment, Deacon noticed how the crowd parted for Olivia, not with the usual recoil of superstitious dread, but with a new, uncertain respect. Later, cleaned up and treated for minor burns and smoke inhalation, they sat on the porch of Olivia's cabin as twilight descended. The events of the day had left them both exhausted but oddly exhilarated. "You didn't have to do that," Olivia said. "Hold my hand in front of everyone, I mean." "Yes, I did," Deacon replied. "Been wanting to do it since the day I met you." She smiled, the tension of years seeming to ease from her shoulders. "It won't change everything overnight. Some people will never believe I'm not cursed." "Some people are fools," Deacon shrugged. "But others just needed to see someone brave enough to go first." Olivia looked down at her hands that had delivered babies, treated illnesses, and today pulled a man from a burning building. Hands that, for the first time in years, didn't feel like harbingers of misfortune. "What happens now?" she asked softly. Deacon reached across the space between them, taking her hand in his. This time she didn't pull away. "Now," he said, "we start living instead of just surviving." Autumn painted the Arizona landscape in subtle golds and russets. The fire at the livery had been a turning point for Olivia's place in redemption. Not overnight change never came that easily, but gradually, perceptibly, the wall of isolation around her began to crumble. Mrs. Lawson invited her to the foaling of her mare. The new schoolteacher, Miss Hartford, sought her advice on treating children's common ailments. Even Dr. Simmons, initially resentful of her medical knowledge, had begun to consult with her on difficult cases, his professional curiosity eventually overcoming his prejudice. Not everyone changed their minds. Marshal Mitchell remained coldly distant, and several families still crossed the street to avoid her. But for the first time in 3 years, Olivia walked through town without keeping her eyes fixed on the ground. And occasionally, someone would smile or nod in greeting. For Deacon, the months since the fire had brought their own changes. Old Quinn, impressed by his work ethic and quick learning, had offered him a partnership in the ranch, a small share now, with the promise of more as the old man grew less able to manage the daily operations. "No family of my own," Quinn had explained gruffly. Rather see the place go to someone who'll care for it proper than sell to some corporation from back east. The arrangement gave Deacon something he hadn't had since before the war: roots, a future, something to build on. And increasingly, the person he wanted to build that future with was Olivia. They had grown closer since the day of the fire, their relationship deepening beyond friendship into something neither had expected to find in redemption. Deacon spent most of his free time at her cabin, helping expand her herb garden, repairing her leaky roof, or simply reading beside her in comfortable silence as evening fell. They were careful with public displays of affection. Redemption wasn't ready for that, and perhaps they weren't either. But among trusted friends like Quinn or in the privacy of her home, they no longer hesitated to hold hands, to share gentle touches, to exist in each other's space as couples do. The first time Deacon kissed her a cool evening in September, as they sat on her porch watching fireflies, Olivia had trembled like a leaf in his arms. Not from fear of curses, but from the simple, overwhelming joy of being wanted, being cherished, after so long alone. As October's chill settled over the territory, Deacon found himself planning for a more permanent arrangement. He'd saved nearly every penny of his wages, building a modest nest egg. The small house on Quinn's property that came with his partnership would need work to be properly habitable, but he'd already begun repairs in his spare time. All that remained was to ask the question that had been on his mind for weeks. He chose a Sunday afternoon for his proposal. They had ridden to a secluded spot by the creek. Olivia perched side saddle on Thunder while Deacon walked alongside for a picnic. The location held special meaning for them both. It was where they'd first really talked about their pasts, their dreams, the events that had shaped them. Olivia spread the blanket beneath a cottonwood tree while Deacon unpacked the basket she'd prepared: fried chicken, biscuits, apple preserves, and a flask of sweet tea. Simple fare, but more delicious for the company. "Quinn says we should expect an early winter," Deacon remarked as they ate. "Says the squirrels are gathering extra nuts and the cattle are growing thicker coats than usual." Olivia smiled. "The old ways of predicting weather are often more reliable than we give them credit for. My father always said animals know things we've forgotten how to sense." "Speaking of Quinn," Deacon continued, trying to sound casual, "he's offered me the use of that small house on the north side of his property, the one that used to belong to his foreman before he retired to live with his daughter in Tucson." "That's wonderful," Olivia said warmly. "You've earned his trust. It needs work: new roof, some windows replaced, a proper cooking stove." Deacon set aside his plate, suddenly finding it difficult to eat. "But it could be comfortable, especially if it wasn't just me living there." Olivia's hand stilled in the act of pouring more tea. "What are you saying, Deacon?" He met her gaze directly. "I'm saying I love you, Olivia Blackwood. Have since the day you walked into a burning building after me, probably before that if I'm honest with myself, and I'm asking if you might consider becoming my wife." The teacup slipped from Olivia's fingers, spilling across the blanket. She barely noticed. "Your wife," she whispered. "Deacon, the town, hang the town," he said firmly. "This isn't about them, it's about us, about building something together that neither of us thought we'd find again. A home. A family, maybe someday." Tears welled in Olivia's eyes. "You would want that with me. Only with you." Deacon reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object, a simple gold band with a modest pearl. "It was my mother's. She gave it to me before I left for the war, said to save it for when I found a woman worth building a life with." He held it out to her. "I found her." Olivia looked at the ring, then at the man offering it, the man who had walked beside her when everyone else turned away, who had believed in her goodness when she herself had begun to doubt it. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking on the word. Yes, Deacon Reed, I will marry you. His hand was steady as he slipped the ring onto her finger, but his eyes glistened with emotion. When he pulled her into his arms, kissing her with all the tenderness and passion he'd held in check for months, Olivia felt something inside her finally, completely heal the part that had believed herself unworthy of love. They married on Thanksgiving Day, a date chosen deliberately to symbolize their gratitude for finding each other against all odds. The ceremony was small, held in Quinn's front parlor rather than the town church, with the old rancher giving the bride away and a circuit-riding preacher officiating. The guest list surprised them both. In addition to Quinn and Johnson from the livery, several townspeople accepted their invitations: Mrs. Lawson and her twins, the school teacher Miss Hartford, Dr. Simmons, sober and properly attired, and a handful of others who had gradually come to see Olivia as a healer rather than a harbinger of doom. Marshall Mitchell declined the invitation, as expected. But the morning of the wedding, a package arrived at Olivia's cabin: a finely crafted silver hairbrush with her initials engraved on the handle and a brief note. My late wife would have wanted you to have this. She believed in second chances. Perhaps I should too. Olivia wore a simple dress of deep blue rather than traditional white, with wildflowers in her hair instead of an elaborate veil. To Deacon, waiting nervously by the preacher's side, she had never looked more beautiful than when she entered Quinn's parlor on the old man's arm, her face radiant with a joy few in redemption had ever seen her express. The ceremony was brief but meaningful, the traditional vows spoken with clear voices and unwavering certainty. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Deacon took Olivia's face gently between his hands and kissed her before their assembled guests, a public declaration that this woman, long feared and shunned, was his chosen partner for life. The small reception that followed was surprisingly merry. Quinn had splurged on good whiskey for the occasion, and Mrs. Lawson had coordinated with other women to prepare a feast worthy of Thanksgiving. There was music from Johnson's fiddle, laughter, and even dancing in the cleared space of Quinn's dining room. As Deacon led Olivia in a waltz, holding her closer than propriety might dictate, he marveled at the transformation in her. The woman who had once flinched from accidental contact now moved confidently in his arms, her smile uninhibited, her eyes bright with happiness. "Mrs. Reed," he murmured, savoring the sound of her new name, "has a nice ring to it." "It does," she agreed, her cheeks flushed from dancing and joy. "Though I suspect some in town will still call me the witch woman behind my back." "Their loss," Deacon said. "Anyone who can't see the good in you isn't worth worrying about." Later, as they prepared to leave for the small house that would be their home, Quinn pulled Deacon aside. "Proud of you, son," the old man said gruffly. "Takes courage to follow your heart when the whole world's telling you not to." "Learned that from you," Deacon replied. "Never seen you back down from what you thought was right." Quinn laughed. "Too stubborn and too old to care what fools think." He glanced at Olivia, who was accepting a shy hug from one of the Lawson twins. "You two are good for each other, and may be good for this town too in ways they don't yet understand." The years that followed proved Quinn right. Deacon and Olivia built a life together that gradually, inexorably changed Redemption's perception of them both. Their small house on Quinn's land became known for its open door and warm hearth. Olivia continued her healing work, but now with Deacon's support and protection. Her reputation grew beyond Redemption's boundaries, bringing patients from neighboring settlements who had heard of the skilled healer with gentle hands and extensive knowledge of both traditional and modern medicine. Dr. Simmons, initially territorial, eventually became a collaborator rather than a competitor. When his drinking finally caught up with him in the winter of 1877, leaving him with a palsy that made surgery impossible, it was Olivia who stepped in to assist, her steady hands guided by his experienced eye. Together, they saved lives that would have been lost if either had continued working alone. Deacon thrived as a rancher, his partnership with Quinn expanding to include additional grazing land and a small breeding program for quality horses. He had a natural way with animals and a head for business that complemented the old man's experience. When Quinn passed peacefully in his sleep in 1879, he left the ranch entirely to Deacon, with the stipulation that it always remain the Reed and Quinn Ranch, in name a legacy that Deacon honored proudly. The greatest joy came in the spring of 1880, when Olivia gave birth to twins, a boy they named Quinn, after the man who had believed in them both, and a girl they called Margaret, after Deacon's mother. The arrival of the Reed twins became something of a celebration in redemption, with even former skeptics bringing gifts and well wishes. Perhaps the most significant moment of reconciliation came when Marshall Mitchell, gray-haired but still imposing, appeared at their door one evening, hat in hand, asking if Olivia would examine his wounded shoulder, an old injury that had never healed properly and was causing him increasing pain. "Heard you helped Jones with something similar," he said gruffly. "Thought maybe." Olivia welcomed him in without hesitation, treating him with the same care and respect she showed all her patients. As she worked, applying a poultice and explaining the exercises that would help restore mobility, the marshal studied her face. "You know," he said finally, "you have your father's eyes, good eyes, seeing eyes." He paused. "He was a fine doctor, would be proud of what you've become." It was as close to an apology as the proud man could manage, but Olivia understood what it cost him. "Thank you, Marshal. That means more than you know." By the time their twins were 5 years old, running wild and beloved across the ranch, most of Redemption had forgotten or chosen to forget that they had ever believed Olivia Blackwood Reed to be cursed. Children who had once been pulled away from her path now brought her wildflowers and asked for stories. Women who had crossed themselves at her approach now consulted her on everything from childbirth to preserving fruit. There were still a few, the deeply superstitious, the stubbornly prejudiced, who maintained their distance. But they were increasingly in the minority, their whispers fading into irrelevance against the reality of the life Olivia and Deacon had built together. On their 10th wedding anniversary, the town of Redemption surprised them with a celebration at the newly built community hall. Nearly everyone attended, bringing food and gifts and, most precious of all, acceptance. Mrs. Patterson, once among the most vocal accusers, presented Olivia with a handmade quilt, each square contributed by a different family in town. "For healing our bodies," she said quietly, "and for teaching us to heal our minds of foolish fears." That night, after the celebration, Deacon and Olivia sat on the porch of their home, no longer the small house on Quinn's land, but a comfortable ranch house they had built as their family and prosperity grew. Their twins slept soundly inside, exhausted from the festivities. "Did you ever imagine this?" Olivia asked, her head resting on her husband's shoulder as they gazed at the star-filled sky. 10 years ago, when you first walked into Redemption and everyone warned you about the cursed woman," Deacon's arm tightened around her. "No," he admitted. "I hoped we might find some peace together, but this." He gestured toward the town lights visible in the distance. "Never thought I'd see the day when Redemption truly lived up to its name." Olivia smiled, thinking of how far they had come from isolation and distrust to community and belonging. "It just took someone brave enough to show them another way," she said. Someone willing to take my hand when everyone else was afraid. Best decision I ever made, Deacon said, turning to kiss her softly. And I'd do it all again tomorrow. As they sat together in the quiet of the evening, surrounded by the life they had built through love and persistence, Olivia reflected on the strange, winding path that had brought her here, the tragedy that stranded her in redemption, the years of loneliness and accusation. The day a dusty cowboy refused to believe in curses. Once, she had believed herself condemned to solitude. Now she understood that sometimes salvation came not in dramatic rescues, but in simple acts of courage, like a man taking a woman's hand in front of a fearful town, showing them all that love was stronger than superstition, braver than fear, more enduring than ignorance. In the end, that was the true magic of their story, not curses broken or spells undone, but hearts opened, minds changed, and a community healed through the most powerful medicine of all, love that refused to be denied.